Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. The gallery at Cal IT 2, in association with the Visual Arts Department, is very pleased to welcome Mark Dery for a presentation inspired by his new essay collection, I Must Not Think Bad Thoughts. Essays, drive-by essays on American dread, American dreams, which, by the way, is for sale in the lobby tonight. Much of Mark's work has dealt with the cultural effects of the digital age. He came into prominence in the early 90s discourses around cyberculture, in which he played a seminal role. He's widely associated with the concept of culture jamming, the tactical media practice he popularized through his 1993 monograph, Culture Jamming, Hacking, Slashing, and Sniping in the Empire of Signs. Mark helped inaugurate cyber studies as a field of serious inquiry, beginning with the scholarly anthology Flame Wars, the Discourse of Cyberculture, that he edited in 1994, and then later in the 1990s with his monograph Escape Velocity, Cyberculture at the End of the Century, taking readers on an unforgettable journey into the dark heart of the information age. He introduced us to a wide array of characters on the fringe of computer culture: underground roboticists, cybersex enthusiasts, virtual reality designers, and all manner of aspiring cyborgs. As technoculture has become indelibly intertwined with pop culture in all its technophiliac and technophobic splendor, Mark Dery has been right there, writing with rare lucidity in magazines like Art Forum, Cabinet, Elle, the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Salon, Spin, and Wired. In his book, The Pyrotechnic and Sanitarium, American Culture on the Brink, he centered his critique of the contemporary pop cultural landscape around a giddy whirl of euphoric horror where cartoon and nightmare meld into one. A world where horror and wonder, beauty and repulsion are held in quivering tension. In his current essay collection, he takes us even further, generating razor-sharp insights into the depths of the contemporary American psyche, drawn from its increasingly bizarre cultural artifacts. White supremacists stockpiling heavy weaponry for the zombie apocalypse they believe is just around the bend. Viral rumors and conspiracy theories that spread like some postmodern pandemic through social media and forwarded emails. Our national love affair with guns, our religious fundamentalism, our fear-stricken willingness to sacrifice our freedoms to the war on terror, the utopian promise of our democratic experiment corrupted by corporate influence and fractured by class war and ideological lunacies. For Mark Dery, chaos is the new normal in contemporary America. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome him as he welcomes us to the American Madhouse. Please welcome Mark Dery.
Thank you, Professor Crandall, for that suspiciously terse introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to all of you for turning out. Those of you with laptops open, I do hope you are blogging or tweeting about the event. It's extremely distracting to a speaker to see it, so you may keep them open if you'd like. But I would be chagrined if you were prepping for your advanced Ukrainian course or nanotechnology 2. I'm going to talk tonight about the somber, brow-furrowing, deeply serious subject of zombies. But before I do, I'd like to talk a little bit about the American Gothic. I situate the zombie phenomenon within a larger kind of philosophical landscape that I would call the American Gothic. And the American Gothic, unlike the British Gothic, which comes out of the late 19th century, obviously, and to a degree the 18th century, has to do with the crushing burden of history and the feeling that all of those centuries of revenant cadavers and aristocracy and inheritance weigh down upon a culture. Whereas in America, a country that reeks to heaven of God, as I like to say, our American Gothic has much more to do, I think, with Puritanism and hypocrisy. So my abiding subject in the new book is America. And like the neocons and their devolutionary descendants, the hover-round hordes of the Tea Party, I'm a devout believer in American exceptionalism, though not as my friends on the right understand it. I think that America is historically unique, there's no doubt about it, in the fervor of its dream of itself as the proverbial shining city upon a hill, showered in God's grace, and simultaneously in the pitch blackness of the dark places in our national psyche. Also in the big man on campus swagger of its self-regard and the sacrament sentimentality of its self-mythologization, but at the same time, the mocking distance between our patriotic fables and the bred-in-the-bone bigotry and brutality of our history, a sustained crescendo of violence, official criminality, and perversions of democracy so grotesque they'd bring a blush to Caligula's cheek. Covert operations, state-sanctioned torture, extraordinary rendition, the rollback of civil liberties, the rise of the surveillance state. You know the drill. There's a marvelous quote from the French postmodern philosopher king, Jean Baudrillard, a kind of a pomo de Tocqueville. And he put it nicely in his book, America, in an ironic paean to New York City that I think is easily repurposed as an ironic paean to the entire country. He writes, "It is a world completely rotten with power, wealth, senility, indifference, Puritanism and mental hygiene, poverty and waste, technological futility and aimless violence. And yet, I cannot help but feel that it has something about it of the dawning of the universe." He's talking about America here. Now, as it happens, the Puritan divine John Winthrop's famous line, his homily about the city upon a hill, I think really dramatizes our split personality as a nation. And the Janus-faced creature is itself a kind of a Gothic trope. I mean, we think of Two-Face and Dick Tracy. We think of Batman and the Joker as being sort of a literalization of a weird hierarchical dualism or a philosophical binary, or the myth of the doppelganger, which is itself another Gothic myth. But this idea of the split self, proverbially and canonically Jekyll and Hyde, I think in our case as a nation, that weirdly bifurcated personality that I'm arguing kind of springs from the hypocrisy of the Judeo-Christian Puritan tradition on the one hand, and our absolute feral frontier lawlessness on the other hand, I think is really wonderfully emblematized by this meme, if you will, this trope of the shining city upon the hill. And its curious travels, its bizarre half-life in the mass unconscious after its initial coinage. So there's the thing itself, and then there's the weird way in which it sprouts legs and kind of walks around in the American unconscious. Well, the sort of locus classicus for that quote, of course, is Winthrop exhorting his shipmates on the Arabella in flight from religious persecution in England to turn the Massachusetts Bay colony into a model of Christian charity. And he conjures a kind of a new Jerusalem in the wilderness. He says, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. When he shall make us a praise and glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." Famous sermon. But I think this contains in utero this American Gothic I'm talking about. And it really neatly concresses or encapsulates sort of the bedtime stories we like to tell ourselves as a nation. I think it's all there, or at least an evil gleam of it, right? The heady sense of exceptionalism, the kick-ass triumphalism that would one day take shape in the frat house war chant, USA, USA. The internal tension held in matter-antimatter balance throughout American history, as I said, between Christian values and Enlightenment virtues, because Winthrop is a Puritan divine, as I mentioned, but he's also Cambridge educated. He'd practiced law at the Inner Temple in England. And other polarizations include the dreams of liberty and justice for all coexisting uneasily with theocratic rule in a Puritan colony. Case in point, no sooner had the Puritans built their shining city upon a hill than they began busying themselves persecuting other religious minorities, like the Quakers. So the afterlife of Winthrop's ringing phrase, I really think, is very instructive about the false front of the American dream. One of the earliest instances of it being repurposed and deployed by a politician in public discourse was January 1961. In his last formal speech before assuming the presidency, JFK weaves Winthrop's words into his address to the General Court of Massachusetts. And he notes that, quote, "The eyes of all people are truly upon us, and our governments in every branch, at every level, national, state, and local, must be as a city upon a hill, constructed and inhabited by men aware of their great trust and their great responsibilities." And then, of course, in what has become an absolutely obligatory ritual now in public life, he has to humbly ask for God's help and his audience's prayers in fulfilling the nation's sacred trust in him. He hopes that history would judge his administration, quote, as men of integrity, men who never ran out on either the principles in which they believed or the people who believed in them, quote unquote, standard bearers of the American way, quote, devoted solely to serving the public good and the national interest, and so on, scaling Purple Mountain majesties. As we now know, JFK's Republic of Virtue had some troubling secrets buried in its basement. The Kennedy family's ties to the mob, little things like plots to assassinate troublesome foreign leaders like Castro with the famous exploding cigar, I kid you not. President's role in the ouster and murder of the South Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem, an event that more than any other arguably led to the American nightmare in Vietnam, and making a mockery of gilt-edged rhetoric about men of integrity, perhaps most bizarrely and most gothically, the Kennedy brothers' compulsive womanizing, so rapacious it stunned the Secret Service agents who were privy to it. Here's a marvelous passage from investigative reporter Seymour Hersh's book, The Dark Side of Camelot, once again invoking this kind of binarism, the Gothic trope of Two-Face or Jekyll Hyde. Hersh writes, Jack Kennedy had been living a public lie as the attentive husband of Jacqueline, the glamorous, high-profile First Lady. In private, Kennedy was consumed with almost daily sexual liaisons and libertine partying, to a degree that shocked many members of his personal Secret Service detail. The sheer number of Kennedy's sexual partners, the recklessness of his use of them escalated throughout his presidency. The women, sometimes paid prostitutes, would be brought to Kennedy's office or his private quarters without any prior Secret Service knowledge or clearance. Now and again, a Secret Service agent was dispatched to D.C.'s distinguished Mickelson Gallery, charged with the somber responsibility, no doubt in the name of, quote, serving the public good and the national interest that he had invoked earlier, of delivering for framing, quote, sexually explicit photos of a naked president with various paramours in the Lincoln Room. And one image, and this stuff is straight out of The Shining, you know, all that's missing is the guy in the dog suit filleting someone on a bed. In one image, JFK gambles with two women, all three of them wearing masks. Cue the original cast recording of the musical Camelot, a Kennedy favorite. I wonder what the king is doing tonight. What merriment is the king pursuing tonight? So that's one posthumous life of the City on the Hill trope that I think sets in nice, melodramatic, and stark relief the chasm between appearance and reality, between public pieties about our Puritan forebears and God watching down on us and shedding his grace upon us, and what happens in the Lincoln bedroom with masks on. Now, Ronald Reagan, as most of you may know, those of you who are students of history, was famously taken with Winthrop City and recycled the phrase over and over again. And he evoked it in his 1984 acceptance of the Republican Party presidential nomination, and then again in '89 in his farewell speech to the nation, in which he gave us the Disney version of Winthrop, rhapsodizing about a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. But peel back the mask of the avuncular gibber enshrined in conservative myth, and you'll find the mendacious schemer who gave Congress the one-finger salute, green-lighting illegal arms sales to fund the right-wing insurgency against Nicaragua's leftist government, the credulous old ostrich who swallowed his weight in supply-side bunkum, championing tax-slashing economic policies that proved a windfall for the wealthy but helped put the middle class on the endangered species list. Christopher Hitchens wonderfully caught a glimpse of the real Ronnie, and he recalled it fondly in his obituary for the man for whom it was always morning in America. Hitchens writes, "I only saw him once up close, which happened to be when he got a question he didn't like. Was it true that his staff in the 1980 debates had stolen President Carter's briefing book? They had. The famously genial grin turned into a rictus of senile fury. I was looking at a cruel and stupid lizard." His reply was that maybe his staff had and maybe they hadn't, but what of it? What about the leak of the Pentagon Papers? Thus, a secret theft of presidential documents was equated with the public disclosure of needful information. This was a man never short of a cheap jibe or the sort of falsehood that would, however laughable, buy him some time. Okay, so I'm going on a bit about this, but I'm setting the stage for zombies, and we'll get to them in a minute. If I can resurrect, speaking of resurrectionism, oh dear. Okay, well, maybe I can coax this thing back to life. Okay. No, don't go to sleep. Okay. So I believe the American Gothic, as I said, is as revealing about who we are as a nation as our noblest moments. What precisely do I mean by the American Gothic? Well, I mean the stomach-plunging drop from reassuring myth to ugly truth, the distance between our dream of ourselves and the face staring back at us from the cultural mirror. And I think, you know, as good an example of any of the American Gothic, what I mean by that, the locus classicus, or the sort of ur-text for my purposes, is David Lynch's Blue Velvet. I think it's the quintessential example. I'd call it kind of a crime scene excavation of the crawl space in the American unconscious, as rendered by Norman Rockwell. Lynch's movie reminds us that it's the bedtime stories we like to tell ourselves most, the consoling fictions about JFK's Camelot, Reagan Country, Disney's Main Street USA, Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, an incredibly dark movie, obviously, Mark Twain's Boyhood Idols. It's those sorts of texts that inevitably have the darkest undersides, the consoling fictions, the reassuring bedtime stories. That darkness has always been there in this new world that, as Baudrillard said, has something of the dawning of the universe about it, if you know where to look for it. And I think Lynch's text is kind of an update of Nathaniel Hawthorne in some ways, the great Gothic writer who took as his recurring subject the Puritans and their many little darknesses. Hawthorne knew these things. He knew that the Benjamin Franklin side of the American character, and I'm given to understand we're here in a school of technology and engineering and technoculture studies, so this may strike a responsive chord with some of you. The Benjamin Franklin side of the American character, scientific, pragmatic, ingeniously inventive, forever infatuated with the new, turned to face the future, is countervailed by our inner Cotton Mather, reactionary, self-righteous, his God-haunted mind cobwebbed by superstition, witchcraft, demonic possession, and other wonders of the invisible world, as Mather called them. And I mean, we can see this abundantly evidenced today. 9/11 conspiracy theories, dark mutterings about inoculations and vaccinations as the root cause of autism. The pervasive myth against all evidence that Obama is a Muslim, that Kubrick shot the moon landings and Darwin is a rotting heap of falsehoods. The Cotton Mather is still alive and well and with us. Hawthorne's short story, Young Goodman Brown, I think does for Winthrop's Puritan America what Blue Velvet did for the Reagan 80s. So for those of you who haven't read the story, like Jeffrey Beaumont, the all-American college kid in Lynch's film, Young Goodman Brown is this sort of stalwart, upstanding, righteously religious Puritan, but he's drawn to the depravity behind the rickrack and gingerbread of small-town America. He sneaks off to a witch's sabbath in the wild wood, where he's horrified to see, among the fiend worshippers giving the devil his due, quote, faces that would be seen next day at the council board of the province, and others which, Sabbath after Sabbath, looked devoutly heavenward and benignantly over the crowded pews from the holiest pulpits in the land. So it's not just, people, roomy-eyed rummies rolling around in the gutters who you'd expect to be kneeling before the goat of Mendes. But it's the very most puritanical people in the community who have the darkest shadows in their closets. In his analysis of Blue Velvet, the film critic Robert Sklar offers a profound a definition, I think, of the American Gothic as any. He quotes Lynch, and Lynch says, "I like the idea that everything has a surface which hides much more underneath. I go down in that darkness and see what's there." And then Sklar goes on to say, beneath the surface of this quotidian American dream world lies voyeurism, violence, sadomasochism, sexual aggression, perhaps only a sleeping character's nightmare, or perhaps, for Lynch, the authentic American dream. Now, two things to say about that. And the zombie is obviously sort of part of this neo-Gothic or this new Gothic. But one thing that's quite interesting is this idea that everything has a surface which hides much more underneath. And just as a sort of extempore digression, you can obviously tell I'm reading parts of this, but I'm doing a lot of sort of extemporizing on it. So that the text is going to expand and contract. But this idea that surface always contains kind of chthonic or depraved things, shadows swimming under the ice are never good, makes for a kind of exegetic or deconstructionist Gothic, which is another weird little species of the Gothic, which is semiotics or deconstruction as necromancy for eggheads. The idea that the sort of manifest content of a text, the surface narrative, always conceals something, and that it's usually dark, that the latent content in Freudian terms is always something spooky. And so I find that the critical act is almost arguably inherently kind of Gothic in that sense. So to the essay at hand, Dead Man Walking, pardon me, the subtitle of which is, What Do Zombies Mean? So just a few generic images of zombies. This, I believe, is from the video game Left 4 Dead. Any Left 4 Dead players in here? Is it Left 4 Dead? I think it is. A threadless.com t-shirt, what to do in case of zombie apocalypse. Useful information. Eustace Tilley of The New Yorker, reimagined as a revenant cadaver. More Left 4 Dead gameplay frames. And the graphic novel, The Walking Dead, on which the immensely successful AMC series was based. So I believe that in our Day of the Living Dead, the reanimated seem to be everywhere, from Pride and Prejudice and Zombies Seth Grahame-Smith's inspired mashup of the zombie myth and Jane Austen's Regency novel of manners, to The Walking Dead, a graphic novel about humanity reduced to Hobbesian brutishness in a post-apocalyptic America overrun by the undead, to the splatterpunk video game Left 4 Dead. Now, I truly believe that the zombie is what I punningly call a polyvalent revenant, a bloating signifier that has given shape alternately to repressed memories of slavery's horrors, right? The very first zombie film, White Zombie, 1932. White alienation from the darker other, I Walked with a Zombie, 1943, kind of a post-colonial gothic. Cold War nightmares of mushroom clouds and mega deaths, as well as the looming specter of race riots, Night of the Living Dead, post-traumatic fallout of the AIDS pandemic, and in movies like 28 Days Later and books like Max Brooks's faux historical World War Z, an oral history of the zombie war, free-floating anxieties about viral plagues and bioengineered outbreaks. Now, these days, visions of a zombie apocalypse look a lot like the troubled dreams of an age of terrorism, avian flu and H1N1, when viruses leaped the species barrier and spread via jet travel into global pandemics seemingly overnight. I really think that's why zombies have accelerated. Those of you who follow this meme have probably noticed that they're moving a lot faster. Zombies in 28 Days Later and Left 4 Dead, unlike the sort of shambling hordes of yore, now move at terrifying jump cut speed, unlike their lumbering predecessors. And I think what's happening there is that in the same way that McLuhan used to say that LSD use was the hippies' way of miming the electronic sensorium, acting out the gestalt or the zeitgeist of the hyper-accelerated media age, I think the giddy speed up of the zombie literalizes a culture stuck on fast forward, the vertiginous forward rushing momentum of historical change in our moment, and the sort of dizzy, mind-blurring dynamic of digital culture, the sort of fluid dynamic. I also think, as I said, that the idea of zombieism as a viral disease, in a lot of these more recent films, the living dead are referred to as the infected. And you certainly see that in Colson Whitehead's novel Zone 1 and in 28 Days Later. I think in a culture that is scrubbing its hands raw with antibacterial soap and the ubiquity of these weird hospital-like dispensers everywhere, holding the bacillus at bay, and hospitals now seen as giant petri dishes, roiling with staph infection and stuff. The way in which all of this is now spread, the contagion spreads at dizzy speed through jet travel and so forth. I think these creatures emblematize some of those free-floating anxieties as well. So famously, though, in the post-war decades, as suburban sprawl and mall culture metastasized across America, in most recent memory, the zombie was cast by Hollywood as the decaying face of popular ambivalence toward amok consumerism, implacable consumption machines, the wall-crawling dead of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. And I think I have a Dawn of the Dead image. This is the AMC series, by the way, the Walking Dead. Yeah, there we go, Dawn of the Dead. So Dawn of the Dead kind of literalizes the infantile psychology of consumer culture, right? Its oral fixation, its insistence on instant gratification, and the I shop, therefore I am sense of self-worth, indexed to how pricey your status totems are, the sheer bodaciousness of your McMansion, your Super Duty Ford F-150 long bed pickup, whatever. And the insatiable orality implied by market capitalism's redefinition of citizens as consumers is marvelously literalized in Madison Avenue's cynical slang term for consumers, which is wallets with mouths. So Romero's zombies kind of give that an even more gothic spin. But now I think we're seeing a new iteration of the zombie. A new species of zombie is being midwifed for our unique historical moment. And Jordan, how am I doing on time? Just, make the zombie decapitation movement when I need to cut this short. Okay. Am I doing okay? All right. Everybody all right? Blood sugar's fine? Excellent. Okay. So I think now that the econopocalypse has thrown millions out of work and triggered an upspike in homelessness and eaten the brains of consumer confidence, the zombie has undergone a role reversal, incarnating American fears that the Republic is a shambling shadow of its former glory, left for dead by the near meltdown of the financial system. Zombies are the resident evil of an economy whose moribund state confronts us everywhere we look, and a landscape and littered with examples of the econopocalypse. And I find that oftentimes the sort of public mind, the mass unconscious, hides its psychic secrets in plain sight. Phrases that enter popular parlance, slang terms, really are marvelously self-deconstructing of the culture. So, for example, I don't really think it's any accident that you have zombies arising as one of the dominant revenant specters in the mass unconscious at a moment when, for example, people speak of dead malls is a term used by urbanists to describe completely moribund malls where most of the retail spaces have been evacuated. They can't give them away, right? Or, for example, ghost boxes. Anyone heard that term? A ghost box is a dark, shuttered big box outlet. Or, hilariously, zombie stores. A zombie store is when retailers are forced by dismal sales to reduce their inventory to its bare bones. So everything is huddled together in the middle of the store, surrounded by a sea of empty shelves, which is rather dispiriting for consumer and employee alike. And that has the ironic consequence that their emaciated stock and empty floor space further scares customers away, accelerating the economic death spiral. And then Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate economist in the New York Times, talks a lot about zombie economic policies, which he as a Keynesian believes are policies that don't have a shred of historical evidence to support their alleged efficacy. And he's talking about the shock treatment austerity measures in Europe, and yet are constantly recycled, by the undead at the Heritage Foundation or the Chicago School of Economics or whatever. So David Skoll, the historian of American horror films and narratives, says, zombies represent America hitting a very low bottom as we witness the spectacle of consumer capitalism transforming itself into a feudalistic dance of death. During the summer of 2009, politicians and political pundits alike started hurling the Z word as an all-purpose epithet while the economy collapsed and healthcare reform sputtered. This is still Skoll talking. It's a big block quote. Zombies are, in essence, creatures who've already faced Sarah Palin's death panels. The better to escape brain-dead politics and faceless corporatism. Having cannibalized all their home equity and foreclosed our future, zombies have become everyman avatars that have traded in the forward-looking, if audacious message, I must eat you to live, settling for I must eat you just to stay dead. In recent decades, the zombie has been a cartoonish lampoon of consumer capitalism, but in the current economic mess, all the gathering themes of depersonalization and disenfranchisement have come to a critical mass, still Skoll. The image of real estate representing the living or the haves, besieged by the ravenous dead, the ultimate have-nots, has long been a staple of zombie narratives. You can think of the assault on the house in Night of the Living Dead, right? The sort of last redoubt of white suburban, self-incarceration and safety from the invading hordes. And so he feels that it's never been a more concise cultural statement than now. In the 30s, says Skoll, One reviewer of the film White Zombie saw reflections of breadlines in displaced workers. Today's zombies have an unprecedented in-your-face rawness that seems to embody displaced rage about gut issues like food, shelter, healthcare, the denial of any of these leading to living death or death itself. So, Skoll, though a popular critic who writes for popular outlets, is doing a good kind of Marxian economic determinist analysis here. He's looking at the zombie as an avatar, an incarnation of economic anxieties and financial insecurity. But I think it's fascinating, actually, that he doesn't tease out the connections between this sort of Marxist Gothic, I would call it, and the fact that, in a sense, Marx himself was a Goth. And you can really read him inversely against the grain marvelously. Just as you can read Baudrillard as a sci-fi author and J.G. Ballard as a postmodern theorist, you can read Freud and Marx as two of our greatest Gothic novelists. And this is no mistake, by no accident, because, first of all, Marx lives in an era of premature burials, of resurrectionists, that is to say, grave robbers, of postmortem daguerreotypes, those exquisitely melancholic, heart-wrenching, and yet fascinating daguerreotypes of, dead babies posed on cotton clouds with cardboard wings that were a fixture in the Victorian cult of death. Table wrapping spiritualists, spirit photography. So in his moment, the air is thick with ectoplasm. And at the same time, Marx, as anyone who's read biographies of him knows, loved Gothic fiction. He devoured the stuff. He was had an almost insatiable appetite for the kind of lurid penny dreadfuls of the day, as well as Gothic novels. So it's by no accident, then, that he emerges, at least in my mind, as the unparalleled master of the political Gothic. And truly, he opens the Communist Manifesto in a veritable fog of dry ice. Quote, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." Everyone knows the line. And in Karl Marx, A Life, biographer Francis Wien suggests, as I said a moment ago, that more use value can be derived from capital if it is read as a work of the imagination, a Victorian melodrama, a vast Gothic novel whose heroes are enslaved and consumed by the monster they created. Quote, "Capital, which comes into the world soiled with mire from top to toe and oozing blood from every pore." And that's not an outlier in Marx's iconography and his imaginary. His political economics teems with this sort of imagery that would be right at home in Victorian penny dreadfuls like Varney the Vampire. We see capital that, quote, "vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor" in Capital. Bourgeoisie that has, quote, "become a vampire that sucks out wage laborers' blood and brains." This may be the first appearance of the zombie in the 18th Brumaire, and whose, quote, "prolongation of the working day beyond the limits of the natural day into the night only slightly quenches the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor." Again, Capital. Now, contemporary economic commentators like Matt Taibbi, who writes for Rolling Stone, some of you may have read him, inherit this Marxist Gothic. So Taibbi takes up Marx's tune. Most of you have probably heard the eminently quotable line, unforgettable once you've heard it, his characterization of the investment bank Goldman Sachs as, quote, "a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money." Clearly not a believer in the notion that they're doing the Lord's work. So he's very much inheriting that same sort of iconography or imaginary. And as befits a nation whose have-nots and haves regard each other across a Grand Canyon-sized income gap that's yawning wider by the minute, America's nightmares are haunted not only by zombies, but by vampires as well. The blood-sucking Wall Street elite drunk on seven-figure bonuses and the dead-eyed, bone-gnawing underclass. And I'd like to take a moment, if you'll indulge me, to unpack that little binary, the binary of the vampire and the zombie. So who is the vampire in this kind of dialectical relationship between monsters? Well, the vampire is obviously the other end of the economic pyramid, the Lloyd Blankfeins, or I dare say the Mitt Romneys, and his hair is perfect, which is very vampiric. The vampire is a symbol of a parasitic plutocracy, battening on the tears and toil of wage labor, and has been a stock character in the demonology of class war at least since Marx. So with predictable perversity, America's winner-take-all culture has embraced the vampire as an aspirational figure. And why not? Whether a scion of old money with a continental accent or a conscienceless monster with tasseled loafers chainsawing workers to bolster quarterly earnings, the vampire has perfect hair, a sommelier's taste in type O, and more money than God, or for that matter, Mr. Blankfein. He's a photogenic poster boy for the new social Darwinism. Now, here where neoliberal capitalism is virtually a state religion on par with Juche in North Korea, and where the myth of the level playing field is impervious to fact, for example, the 80% of the nation's wealth is held by those in the top 20% of the economic pyramid. You guys probably know these stats. CEO who a decade ago raked in a mere 30 times the average wage laborer's salary now makes 116 times that worker's income. In such a cultural landscape, nobody wants to be a zombie. America loves a winner. Dead on their feet, zombies began as a glassy-eyed metaphor for the plight of Hades' human chattel, forced to do the boss's bidding, even in death. And that's something that's really forgotten is, again, the economic roots of the zombie myth. The zombies come from Haiti, but this is a post-colonial hangover. It's a post-colonial Gothic. It's the troubled dream of people who felt the lash of slavery and were forced marched into the fields and worked until they dropped in their traces. And that's often left out of critical readings in film class of White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie. And this is truly a racial Gothic. And so that's kind of the seed DNA of the myth, if you will. And in his classic ethnographic study, Voodoo in Haiti, Alfred Metreau underscores the parallel between the living dead and Haitian blacks under the colonial whip. He says, the zombie is a beast of burden, which his master exploits without mercy, making him work in the fields, weighing him down with labor, whipping him freely, and feeding him on meager, tasteless food. Like Frankenstein, a working stiff with neck bolts, ready-made for the Fordist factory and the tailorized workplace, zombies are well and truly wage slaves. By contrast, a solitary hunter, the vampire is well suited to Ayn Randian fantasies of Promethean captains of industry, right? Self-made masters of their own destiny who need no convincing on Rand's, quote, virtues of selfishness. Zombies, by contrast, are trade unionists from beyond the grave, a Heritage Foundation wonk's worst nightmare of collectivism on the march, the downsized and the disenfranchised jolted into action by class consciousness. Now, here, I'm just going to quickly diddle this thing so it doesn't go to sleep on me again. And here's some of the images some of the texts I touched on. I want to do a little excursus, just sort of extemporaneously for a moment, sort of piling riff upon riff, because I said a moment ago that zombies, by contrast, are, as I said, sort of a Randian nightmare of collectivism on the march. But I think fascinatingly, as I said at the very beginning of the lecture, punningly, this creature, this monster, is a polyvalent revenant. Polyvalent, multivalent, meaning having baklava-like layers of meaning, right? It's richly intertextual and densely sedimented with subtext. So we can really freight this floating signifier with many different readings, and not gratuitously, and not in a way that overreads or overdetermines, but I think very legitimately. So while yes, I think this sort of Marxian Gothic, this economic determinism, is a very useful prism for refracting some of the meanings in the zombie serves many masters. And let me give you an example, just as a kind of a fractal branchlet, a bifurcation in the argument, having said that, to a libertarian or to, someone whose dearest horror is the trade union, the zombie can sort of symbolize collectivism or organized labor on the march. the zombie also stands in an age very much infatuated with the wisdom of crowds, smart mobs, right, flash mobs, stands in for the notion of other collectives. One of the fascinating things about zombies that's rarely remarked upon is, to the best of my knowledge, and I'll happily stand corrected if anyone can dredge up a counterexample, but the zombie is the only creature, the only zombie monster in the horror imaginary whose identity is corporate, whose identity is collective. Call us legion, for we are many. Zombies only exist as a crowd. They take their identity from the crowd, right? And so they invite us to ruminate philosophically on the history of the different taxonomies of the group. There is the crowd, which has become kind of a household deity in the age of social networking and massively multiplayer online role-playing games and the vastly connected network that is the internet, and flash mobs in the embodied world. So there's this fetishization of the crowd, and yet there's simultaneously a fear of the mob. And then there's that curious word that's fallen into disuse, the masses, right? Which sort of reeks of 30s Trotskyite reading groups, No one really wants to be part of the masses anymore. And I don't believe that word is even used except by nonagenarians like Noam Chomsky. But so crowds good, mobs not so good. But what's quite interesting is that we have done we've reversed the polarities of the image of the crowd. If you'll grant me, for purposes of debate, that the crowd and the mob are sort of two Janus-like or Jekyll-Hyde faces of the same rhizomatic, or in chaos and complexity theory terms, the same strange attractor, when society reaches a highly turbulent state and is, as complexity theorists say, far from equilibrium, you get these sort of explosions of expressions of popular outrage and mass manias and the delusions of the million. And that's really what the mob is. And so at the turn of the last century, you have this incredible paranoia about mobs. When we witness the birth of mass psychology, you have Gustave Le Bon in 1896, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, talks about the individual. And the psychological model then is that the individual is a rational actor, basically indistinguishable from the bounded, centered, coherent, inward-turning, completely reasoning Enlightenment subject as late as the late 19th century. And yet, when you join a mob or a crowd, even the individual who is Adam Smith's perfectly rational actor can lose his marbles and do all manner of insane things. And so Le Bon in 1896 says, the hypnotized individual tossed in the heaving sea of the crowd is, quote, a slave of all the unconscious activities of his spinal cord, no longer himself but an automaton who has ceased to be guided by his will, or worse yet, an atavistic throwback who has, quote, devolved several rungs in the ladder of civilization. Now, one-on-one, says Le Bon, that same man may be a cultivated individual, but in a crowd, he is a barbarian, that is, a creature acting by instinct. In other words, virtually indistinguishable from a zombie. So I think the zombie reminds us that despite our fetishization of wise crowds, the presumption being that not any individual knows everything, but everyone in the room knows something. And so we fuse synaptically into some sort of blob-like corporate brain, and we're able to channel our inner Wikipedia, right, and get something done. So the Byronian, romantic, Promethean individual, the engineer hero of 1930s technocracy in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, moving the levers of power high up in the Tyrrell pyramid, where while the lumpens seethe around in the streets, completely out of fashion. Now with social networking, we're all fused into one global Gaian mind or whatever it is. And I believe that something very strange is happening psychologically. I believe there's been a kind of an explosive decompression in which the self, that is to say the private, the personal, is extruded like some sort of psychic pseudopod into public space, right? So you get people Twittering and Facebook posting and maundering on into their cell phones about, I don't know, vaginal warts and, herpes and, multiple divorces and the most incredibly personal things, and someone with a Bluetooth headpiece on will just prattle this out over the meat counter as if they're alone in their solipsistic bubble. So the sense of being alone, of being in private space, has been taken into public in a strange way. We consider ourselves to be alone, behave as if we're alone, even when we're in the midst of a crowd. Inversely and simultaneously, I believe that Ballard's analysis in Crash is quite correct, that having evacuated the savannas of the psyche, our inner landscapes, and sort of depopulated them with all of the traditional actors from the Freudian Gothic, the sort of dark characters, the cast of infantile traumas, that now that empty landscape is filled with media phantasms and conjurations from the spectacle. And what I mean by that is that our inner lives are often populated with characters from TV shows we watch and, films we're devoted to, and characters in supermarket checkout stand tabloids whose everyday doings we consider to be almost the activities of close relatives or friends. So this strange reversal, I think, again, a kind of a reversal of polarities of the public and the private has gone on. I think the zombie in some way kind of evinces or puts a cadaverous, putrescine-reeking face on the fact that we're a little more ambivalent about these wise crowds than we let on. I'll also add one last thought to that little side riff and then arrive happily for some of you, I'm sure, at my peroration. But I was also going to say that the most obvious reading of the zombie that is very rarely done is the other half of the Cartesian split. Never more than in all of human history have we been more bifurcated from, more dissociated from the meat body. And those of you who are immersed in the discourses of technoculture and who think at all about the political myths and the ideological narratives that shape our collective sense of what technology means and what its vices and virtues are surely well aware that we teeter on the brink of the moment that humanity has always dreamed of, right? Which is to step into our thought balloons, untether them, from the little Cartesian homunculus in the pineal gland, moving the levers of the body, and float away to seek our own gravity, in the noosphere or the Neoplatonic Second Life or whatever it is, I mean, the step from language, from sort of, early, simian life forms, the fall out of the prelapsarian world and into speech is obviously the greatest technological development. And from there to the smashing of the atom, Mariner Mars probes, pilotless drones, is but a beat of the eye in technological terms. But that first move from arboreal apes, swinging from branch to branch, to the ability to use the first virtual reality metaphor, and language itself being, of course, all a meta-metaphor, the master metaphor, right? But to model three-dimensional dreams in thought space and wander freely through them, barefoot in the head, as the SF author says, that's the real leap. And I think that now we stand perilously at the very brink of almost, attaining the wet dream of Hans Moravec and every geek in the robotics department at Carnegie Mellon, right? Which is to shed the hideous meat, uncouple the fiber optic umbilicus and download ourselves forever into virtuality. Well, I think what I'm submitting to you is that the zombie again, puts a shambling, cadaverous face on our contempt for the meat body and its seeming obsolescence, nay, even the obsolescence of Darwinian evolution in a moment that is looking more and more Lamarckian. The problem being that the giddy speed up of technology in ways unimaginable even to McLuhan, has now created cultural dynamism and hyperacceleration that is out of all step with Darwinian evolution. And the body begins to look like this decaying, snoring, flatulent, aging, well, at least for those of us who are over 50, not, you guys will live forever and be just as beautiful as you are. You have this sense that the body is this indiscreet obscenity, that shambles along behind our virtual avatars. And more it seems like an encumbrance and an embarrassment. Okay, that's all by way of excursus. And those are some other ways that we can really tease out the many narratives embedded in this floating signifier. I'm going to talk lastly about the racial Gothic, and I want to return to this question of the zombie apocalypse, which is what's very specifically on the minds of many people spinning yarns about the zombie, both in the political imaginary and in popular Gothic fiction. And it's not well considered by cultural critics, so I really want to dive into it a little bit. This is a sort of a Tea Party rally, and there's a kind of a sub-genre of political humor now on the far right, the sort of lumpen proletariat Tea Party right, which is the homology, the equation of Obama or Obama followers with zombies, right? So America's citizens are, zombies, Tea Party, zombies, change for the worse, the bricolage, the appropriation of the Obama iconography, zombie apocalypse, when hell is full and the dead walk the earth, the left will try to reason with them. Marxist Obama, zombies, hungry for your money, thirsty for power, spread the wealth. Obama supporters like zombies, but with no interest whatsoever in brains. But two can play this game. Obama, cool enough to just fucking ignore zombies. The doddering McCain. So I was talking earlier about zombies as, again, trade unionists from beyond the grave, Heritage Foundation Wonk's worst nightmare of collectivism on the march, the downsized and the disenfranchised, jolted into action by class consciousness. I'd like to wrap up by looking at a very peculiar use of the zombie trope on the far right. The circular firing squad of angry white lumpen emptying their political ammo clips at illegal immigrants, Nancy Pelosi, and the Red Menace at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, everything, in other words, but the structural injustices behind their economic woes, sees zombies as harbingers of a post-apocalyptic landscape overrun by Obamaniacs, where the embattled vestiges of what Sarah Palin likes to call real America make their last stand against an engulfing tide of border-jumping aliens, left-wing academics, and brain-eating libtards, as they call them. Stockpiling MREs and heavy weaponry, the survivalist fringe can't wait to live in the America of I Am Legend. When our unwieldy duct-tape democracy collapses into anarchy, we'll revert to the sociopathic utopia of the Western frontier. A happily uncomplicated time when every man, or every well-armed white man at least, was a law unto himself, free from governmental meddling and moral ambiguities. Now, as I delved into white power discourse, on the fungal underside of the web, in the clammy, unlit corners of the mass mind, where the toadstools of white supremacy thrive, I discovered two fascinating things. One is that they use this trope, the zombie apocalypse, seemingly literally. I mean, these are not people overly burdened by irony. And so they talk about the zombie apocalypse as if they really believe it's going to happen. At the same time, they're self-analytical enough to sort of unpack the trope, unpack the metaphor, and let you know they're not taking it literally. So they sort of want to have their brains and eat them too, if you will. That's one thing. The other thing that's quite fascinating, and you see this in right-wing survivalist fiction and a certain strain of right-wing libertarian science fiction, is that when I say they can't wait to live in the America of I Am Legend, I mean it quite literally. And post-apocalyptic fantasies for a certain species of angry white male are a very consoling fiction. The fantasy of hitting the reboot button on society and running the historical film backwards, of watching gays sucked back into their closets, women sucked back into the kitchen, blacks, return to the Middle Passage, chained to their oars, for a certain stripe of American, admittedly, happily, a small group, but nonetheless a somewhat disconcerting one. This is a happy happenstance. This is a sort of a utopian fantasy. It's the moment at which dystopia becomes utopia. What could be better than living in your feral compound in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, armed to the teeth, munching on meals ready to eat, without Obama able to tell you to, put away your banana clip and your belt-fed weapons, and the ability to just mow down everyone in sight and be the law of your own little piece of, God's little acre. I mean, this is really something that gets a certain sort of survivalist out of bed. So, for example, there's a place called survivalblog.com. It's run by a guy named Jim Rawls, and he's also an author. Let me see if I can find. Here's some of the stuff that floats around in this subculture. Kind of a repurposed, tongue-in-cheek daily affirmation poster. Preparedness, because those goddamn zombies aren't going to kill themselves. Here's one of Rawls's novels. Novel of survival and the coming collapse. Here's another one that, interestingly enough, echoes in its cover design the poster for The Walking Dead I showed you earlier. So Rawls and his fellow survivalists are digging in for an apocalypse straight out of Left 4 Dead. As far as they're concerned, they can peer around the corner, they can see it coming. And there's much talk on their discussion boards and their comment threads of, quote, hordes of zombies running rampant when the government fails. One contributor, Michael Z. Williamson, thinks a wicked-looking implement called the Dead-On Tools Annihilator Demolition Hammer will come in handy when the system crashes. And here it is, folks. This is the Dead-On Tools Annihilator Demolition Hammer. Ask for it by name at finer hardware stores everywhere. And Williamson believes that, quote, anyone with bayonet training, which is hell, at least every other person in this room, I hope. Anyone with bayonet training can grip this appropriately and hack through a crowd of zombies, or heft it like an axe and use it on single opponents. An anxious reader writes in, and this anxious reader is typical of this survivalblog.com discussion board because, like any reasonable American, he describes himself as, quote, he has a heavily supplied, fairly secluded, and defensible, very well-armed suburban outpost with several highly skilled sons for fire support. And he's wondering if he should secure a secondary retreat for when it looks as if our ammo is exceeded by the number of urban zombies, which is to say police state drones, same thing, invading the suburbs. Now, by zombies, the survival blog people mean what they call the golden horde, which is a very instructive term. And Rawls and his survivalist brethren mean by that the anticipated large mixed, meaning racially, ethnically mixed, horde of refugees and looters that will pour out of the metropolitan regions. I know this quote because the blog very helpfully provides a glossary of survival blog terminology. So if you're wondering what Golden Horde is, you just look it up. And this is interesting because it really revives sort of the age-old horrors, white survivalist, or just white, middle-class, upper-class horrors of the mongrel metropolis. And you saw that in the wonderfully incarnated in John Rocker's subway ride from hell, where he took the New York subway and heard the glossolalia, babble of all these different languages, and it looked like the UN convocation in his subway car, and he was utterly horrified, and he had a kind of a racist grand mal seizure, and then went off about it in the news. So this very much resonates at the same frequency. The horde trope, as I say, has a familiar ring, especially when coupled with the suggestive adjective golden with its echoes of yellow peril. We've heard it before in colonial whispers of rebellious coolies out on the edge of empire, and in the Turner Diaries, a really fascinating piece of right-wing, Aryan supremacist, survivalist science fiction, an admittedly small genre, Aryan supremacist science fiction, although Starship Troopers arguably is kind of playing footsie with that under the table. But the Turner Diaries is a really bizarre book. Has this kind of revulsion at the mongrel metropolis, and it's a post-apocalyptic sci-fi novel of a race war, sort of racial Armageddon straight out of Charles Manson's fantasies of Helter Skelter, or what Aryan supremacists call Rahowa, racial holy war, that will be a kind of an Armageddon that will usher in a post-apocalyptic landscape in America, total breakdown in society. But the new spin is these guys add zombies to the mix. But this sort of thing is kind of familiar from the Turner Diaries, which came out in 1978, written by a guy named William Luther Pierce, and it was one of Timothy McVeigh's pillow books. Pages of it were found in the remains of the Murrow Center bombing. This guy, Rawls, who runs Survival Blog, actually has a nice way with the well-turned phrase, and he's kind of a dryly funny character, especially when he gets a good rant going. And he's got a real stem winder of a rant on the site where he says the foundational morality of the civilized world is best summarized in the 10 Commandments. He writes this in his Precepts of Rawlsian Survivalist Philosophy. Sure to be hanging on a decoupage plaque in every hardened bunker in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And he says, quote, moral relativism and secular humanism are slippery slopes. The terminal moraine at the base of these slopes is a rubble pile consisting of either despotism and pillage or anarchy in the depths of depravity. Unquote. Better to arm ourselves to the teeth, light out for the territories, and rebuild society in a blast-proof city upon a hill, populated with people like us exclusively. Now, to Browning 35 and the rest of the race warriors and the white supremacist site, stormfront.org, which is even further to the right than survivalblog.com, the zombie apocalypse is a premonition, as I've been saying all along, of race war. But these guys just come right out and say it. And Browning 35 writes, and this is fascinating, it's kind of semi-literate, knuckle-dragging, mouth-breather deconstructionism, It's Derridianism for, people who miss the casting call for California Reich. And so he writes, I've noticed recently that a lot of survivalists and preparedness freaks are big fans of zombie movies, where a small group of people test their skills against an onslaught of blood-sucking and brain-eating ghouls. For white nationalists, which is what they call themselves, it's easy to translate non-whites into the role of the zombies, as they are certainly blood-sucking leeches who are overrunning and ruining our countries, and who in some cases are literally trying to prey on us and eat us. Remember that case a little while ago where that black guy in East Texas killed and ate his white girlfriend? I'll bet she didn't foresee him turning into a zombie. And then Crispy, that's this guy's handle, Crispy, a participant also in Stormfront's discussion threads, is locked and loaded for racial Armageddon. He writes, I'm a big fan of the zombie survival stuff. I've read the Zombie Survival Guide by Max Brooks, as well as his novel World War Z. Both were fun reads, but certainly lacking as far as hardcore survival goes. One must always remember that in a more realistic SHTF, their acronym for shit hits the fans. I like the fact that they have a delicacy about cursing. They're talking about, genocidal racial cleansing on an unimaginable level. These guys are stockpiling automatic weapons, but they can't bring themselves to say the word shit. One has one's delicate sensibilities. And so this guy says, but we've got to remember that in a more realistic SHTF situation, we will be facing armed opposition, not some mindless shambling horde. But it's still nice to imagine sitting on a rooftop all day with a boomstick popping zombie skulls. And I just want to also very quickly touch, just as I wrap up my last paragraph here, that there is something somewhat problematic about The Walking Dead, the AMC series, which is fascinating in many ways, but it does kind of ratify this trope of embattled whiteness, surrounded by this engulfing golden horde. Now, there's an Asian guy who is sort of the typical wimpy, I dare say even quasi-androgynous, and certainly rather childlike, caricature of the effeminate, Asian male. But as the series progresses, he becomes more and more emboldened and seems to be kind of emerging out of his stereotypic shell into more of a rounded three-dimensional character. And there's a black in the first episode, but he's a fleeting presence at best, who is unquestionably, a positive figure. But that show is most interesting, I think, as a rather more progressive meditation on the notion of the utopian dystopia, the felicitous apocalypse, the opportunity to hit a reboot on a little democratic experiment which, at least for the moment, seems to be going horribly wrong. And so you have a kind of a poli-sci graduate seminar. It's as if these people have broken up into a discussion group, in the middle of the zombie apocalypse, where, each one of them, and there isn't a one-to-one correspondence, but each one of them sort of stands in for a different political philosophy. You have the Ragnar, the Redbeard, might is right, feudalist, who believes in rough justice for, anyone who stands up to the alpha male in the tribe. This guy's an apex predator, and he simply believes it, his way is it's my way or the highway, right? Be part of the rubber, part of the road. There's a guy who I think of as clearly coded as Jewish, as sort of a bearded Mosaic patriarch, who's kind of the lawgiver and pleads for clinging to the raveled shred of ethics and morality and keeping the guttering candle of enlightenment going in the gathering gloom. Well, of course, he's quickly snuffed out and gobbled by zombies, or not quickly, but in the fullness of time, Dale, for those of you who follow the series. The politics of the show are quite interesting. I can't quite tell what the dominant sensibility is. There is the imputation that few of us can afford to be touchy-feely, Mr. Rogers, sweater-clad liberals at a moment when people are out to eat your brains. But that is a rather more progressive version, I submit to you, of fantasies about the zombie apocalypse that seem to be desirous of that moment, as opposed to the clearly Aryan supremacist version of the same trope. So to end up, listening to this stuff, listening in a virtual sense, wading through, the septic tank of this discourse and these white power sites, I felt like, there's this one very odd moment where Son of the Mist reminds the assembled white nationalists that World War Z isn't any laughing matter. This guy's kind of a buzzkill in the middle of their just fun discussion of, what if The Walking Dead were a real-life race war. He says, all fun stuff aside, and I've always been a sci-fi fan, and the Day of the Dead was a great semi-comedy movie. He says, except for the race mixing crap. Yeah, that always is kind of a buzzkill in a movie. But he says, the non-whites are the zombies, complete with man-eating and crazed brutal behavior. It will be unleashed full bore when the economy collapses and the super depression starts. Just as zombies do what they do, the non-whites will show their DNA when the time comes. Count on it, they cannot do anything else. The wise are getting out of the multi-culti cities and setting themselves up with dependable compatriots, well thought out, hardened retreats, and lots of supplies. And reading this, I could barely restrain myself from making devil horns at the screen at the irony of the fact that these guys who are sullying our otherwise reasonably decent gene pool are in fact sequestering themselves and incarcerating in Aryan supremacist gulags, which is spectacular. I mean, maybe we can just get a big fucking nuke the shape of the state of Texas and drop the fucker. Apologies to those of you from Texas. I use Texas purely metaphorically, not literally, of course. But in any event, it is kind of extraordinary that it's producing this unintended ironic effect, which is that they are, in effect, sort of quarantining their virulence, in a unassailable redoubt, somewhere in the hills of Appalachia or, Deepwater, West Virginia, or wherever they want to go, which is wonderful for all of the devil-worshipping queers in New York City, where I come from, who will not rest until we have a drive-through abortion on demand. So unfortunately for the Blood and Soil Gang, history teaches us that the war of all against all doesn't end at the gates of the Führer bunker. The problem is that it's only a matter of time. After the chairs are jammed against the doors and the windows are nailed shut, before the survivors succumb to power struggles and paranoia. 28 days later, they're eating each other. Worse yet, you can't always tell us from them. Quote, eyewitness accounts describe the assassins as ordinary-looking people, says a radio announcer in Night of the Living Dead. Aren't they always? Thanks for your indulgence. So you've been immensely patient, and I very much appreciate it. You've been a model audience. Questions, comments, vituperative rants from fellow travelers, fans, frenemies, which is, I guess, the Facebook term of art. Yes, sir.
One of the films that is often overlooked in Romero's zombie tales, which I think to a certain degree fit a number of the kind of allegories that allow the question of how do we read them, is Land of the Dead. In Land of the Dead, the zombies are from Uniontown. They're led by a black mechanic, and between them and the condominiums where all the kind of 1% live are the slums, and basically the slums are used as the fence protecting the 1% from this kind of post-ideological collectivity or movement. And the interesting thing about the film is that it's mainly focused on the lack of ideological cohesion in the living slum. That is, they manifest a kind of atavistic conservatism or a liberal violence there, which doesn't manifest itself in terms of understanding the mechanics of the condominium beside them. And it's only when they become zombies in the movement, led by the Uniontown zombies, that then they enter into this kind of post-ideological collectivity, because they're no longer struggling in this kind of Twin Peaks, this binary of the Gothism of, I don't know, Reaganism, if you will, right, that plays itself out. So would you consider then that in order to understand the Twin Peaks ideology that continues to play out in the American Gothic, that we have to, in a certain sense, as you point out at the end, become the ordinary zombie, in post-ideological, no longer bound to the crowd or the mob, but this other sort of flow. And do you see that as a possibility in the kind of darkness of the American Gothic, or is that too much?
Help me grasp the point of argument. When you say, do you see that? What is the referent?
Well,
What is that?
That is a point of positivity in the zombie allegory.
Well, I'm not entirely sure I grasp the point, but I'll take a stab at it. I'll try to pierce the cloud of unknowing. But what does occur to me, not having seen Land of the Dead, so I'm at a disadvantage in that regard, is that, as I said a moment ago, this notion of the utopian dystopia, right, or the ability to sort of hit the reboot button, does appeal on the left, or rather than array it along a left-right continuum, it does appeal to those with progressive impulses and yearnings, as well as to those with reactionary and retrograde fantasies. And I can't think of many incarnations of the zombie myth that ride into battle with a progressive banner, flapping from their battle standard. But there are certainly examples of a kind of a paradise of polymorphous perversity that is ushered in by the collapse into atavism. Cronenberg's Shivers, right, which is like J.G. Ballard's High Rise, is set in a condominium, set in an apartment building. And it's pulls apart from the riots we saw in the banlieue, the crumbling multi-story government-funded tower blocks that surround Paris like an orbital ring, something straight out of Clockwork Orange, collapsing into decay. In the Ballard novel and the Cronenberg movie, in the Cronenberg film, it's a virus. In the Ballard novel, it's just the curious psychology of people in this high-rise, hence the title of the book. People descend into this libidinal horror that is both very clearly influenced by the anti-Oedipal, voguish, anti-psychiatric doctrines of R.D. Laing and distantly Deleuze and Guattari in the 60s. This notion that lunatics are just a more enlightened species of, Homo sapiens. It's the hippie myth, the king of hearts, and very much allied with the hippie image of the paradisiac or Edenic or prelapsarian child. We've all got to get back to the garden, and part of getting back to the garden is running the, ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny, and the individual timeline runs backwards, so we all become as children, And in Ballard's novel, Ballard rejoices in the breakdown of societal mores in this wonderfully anti-Freudian way. And for those of you who haven't read the book, I commend it to you. The opening line is something like, Smith noticed that the sunset was more beautiful than ever just as he finished eating the dog's haunch. Right? It's one of those lines like the clock striking 13. You're instantly in a world that's irretrievably different from the one we live in. So have I been sufficiently evasive? I think I dodged your bullet. My point is that I can't think of any strict correspondences on the left or on the progressive side for sort of utopian yearnings that express themselves through the zombie vernacular. But the idea of a descent into atavism as a not entirely bad thing, especially if you're an anarchist, Anarchists, of course, are rightly horrified by finger-wagging homilies like Lord of the Flies, right, which suggests that without the state peering over our shoulder, we'd all descend into, feral anarchy and depravity, right? Well, there's another story to be told, and Ballard's High Rise tells it, and I dare say there must be other SF novels like that that cannot, that rub their hands in anticipation of, complete societal collapse and Fifi, the French poodle next door, turning slowly on a spit on your, condo balcony. Other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
I have a question about the role of the hero, and right now in popular culture, there's a kind of obsession with the hero alongside separate but co-equal narratives of the zombie. And in The Walking Dead or in Cormac McCarthy's The Road, there is this sort of the anti-hero is the only hero. And I'm curious about the survivalists and the white supremacists and their notion of heroism, because there was a time when the notion of heroism was a soldier who jumps on the grenade to spare his troop, or Davy Crockett at the Alamo.
Self-sacrificing. Yeah.
But in the zombie apocalypse, self-sacrifice is to become a zombie, right? To become
Yeah.
one of the horde, to become a race mixer in a white supremacist, sort of fantasy. And I'm wondering how then heroism becomes defined, either in, not so much perhaps in zombie narratives, but in the narrative of the zombie as it intersects with the narrative of the survivalists.
What a fascinating question. I mean, doctoral candidates, start your engines. There's a dissertation waiting to be written right there, in my opinion. I don't have a pat answer, but I will say, do remember that in The Walking Dead, and quickly a show of hands, I'm curious to know if all this Walking Dead prattle is just Martian anthropology to 90% of you, or if everybody's reasonably familiar with the series. How many of you have ever seen the thing? AMC, The Walking Dead? Okay. In any event, do remember that it's, for those of you who've not seen it, very quickly, it's about a ragtag band of survivors thrown together by sheer happenstance, struggling to move, to stay one step ahead of the proverbial golden horde. Interestingly, for survivalist tropes, outside Atlanta, Georgia, so it is set in the South. But do be aware, or do recall, that the heroic figure in that series, and I respectfully submit to you that he's not at all an anti-hero. He's quite a hero. He is a former small-town sheriff, and he clings to the semiotics of virtue with white-knuckled tenacity. He wears his cop's uniform and his Smokey Bear hat and his badge, carries his sidearm until his uniform is virtually in tatters, And it's, there's a kind of a romantic appeal to it, and there's a note of melancholy. He's a noble, upstanding man, yet flawed. Now, if you're inclined to see that valorization of law and order as inherently conservative, then a conservative parable, if not. The one thing I would say is that I see a direct, if you will, semiotic or narrative through line from right-wing uses of the chivalric trope, right? And I'll give you a few narrative examples of that in a moment, and the survivalist notion of the lone white man standing up against the engulfing mongrel hordes. So, for example, there's that famous piece of Nazi kitsch. It was an enormous painting that hung somewhere it wasn't the Führer bunker, I think it might have been the Reichstag or Hitler's own office. But it's a piece of very 1920s kitsch. It looks like a badly done Edmund Dulac or possibly James Montgomery flag, right? It's done that 20s straight arrow shirt ad style, but it's Hitler in medieval armor, right, with his helm off, kneeling, and a shaft of light coming down on him. And it is clearly wrapping itself in the semiotic trappings and the myth of chivalry. Now, what's interesting is that Raymond Chandler's famous essay on the hero of his hard-boiled detective stories, all set in L.A., a Gothic city in its own way, right? Philip Marlowe, the guy from The Lady in the Lake and Farewell, My Lovely, and all the classic Chandler novels. There's an essay by Chandler on detective fiction, and it contains the famous line that everyone who's read Chandler knows: "Down these mean streets a man must go. He is not the best man, but he is a good enough man for his world." And he clearly frames him, I think he even uses the word knight, right? He clearly frames him as chivalric. I think there's something inherently fascist in this, and if you'll indulge me for a minute, I'll sandbag this with some evidence. Chandler, and I'm endlessly fascinated by the man as a writer and find his style quite compelling, but is a virulent racist. And the stories are extraordinary studies in the racial Gothic. You know, they're filled with images of, quote, the Jap gardener pulling a weed out of the lawn and sneering at it the way Japs do. In The King in Yellow, a white character goes into the black part of L.A. Where the Smokes live. Now, he's just using the parlance of his day. We can't fault him for that, right? And these things came out in Black Cat magazine, not October, for Christ's sake. Right? So he's part of his moment, but he goes much further. You know, there are always these moments of the racial Gothic in Chandler. And what is noir but industrial Gothic? It's smokestack Gothic. It's the Gothic transposed into the age of Taylorism and Fordism and the unraveling of family ties, the collapse of agrarian economy, the mass movement into the big city, the sort of free-floating anomie and rootlessness, right, after World War I. So inarguably a sort of Gothic. But in the story of The King in Yellow, this character encounters this saloon full of black people, and quote unquote, they regard him with the dead-eyed silence of an alien race, right? You know, so it's almost Burroughsian. It's like something out of the Wild Boys, you know, across these wounded galaxies. You know, they gaze at you with this gazeless gaze, and he's got a moment like that in story after story and novel after novel. They're not just part of the air he's breathing historically. They're not just, little volutes and scrolls and ornamental details. They're a big part of what he's all about. And his last novel, Playback, set right here in La Jolla, has a moment of unutterable racial Gothic. It makes my hair stand on end just thinking about it. It's the weirdest damn thing I've ever read. There's a scene where Philip Marlowe, the detective, who again is the lone white guy, a character from frontier myth, a law unto himself, surrounded by queers and rapacious gold-digging women and stunted, shorter, darker, smellier brown people, right? Whether there's a Native American at one point who's described as smelling like dung, his hair is greasy. But in this novel, Playback, Philip Marlowe meets a guy who's this rat-like, scuttling, weaselly, brilliantine-haired, sallow-faced, pock-marked creature who scuttles around in the basement of the hotel he's staying in, parking cars. And at one point, Marlowe says, "What are you anyway?" You know, in effect, asking for the guy's papers, meaning, "What race are you?" And the guy gives this amazing speech. He says, "You wouldn't want to be me. I'm everything." And he says, "I'm part Filipino, I'm part Japanese, I'm part black, I'm part American Indian, I'm part white." And it's this polymorphously perverse, polysemic embodiment of the racial uncanny, you know. This sort of mongrel metropolis made of flesh, you know, every race and ethnicity flowing into this chimerical protean horror. And, you know, the narrator, Philip Marlowe, and thus by proxy Chandler, just does this recoil of revulsion from the character. And then the guy later hangs himself in this incredibly seedy, sordid Gothic death. He's found dangling in an outhouse, you know, with a hypo full of smack in one vein. But the imputation, the inference is clear that he simply could not live with the monster he saw in the mirror. It's unimaginably bizarre. So, these are kind of I find the chivalric loner highly problematic, and a little bit of that shadow falls over Rick, the cop in The Walking Dead, because of the historical subtext of this notion of the chivalric male, which is very implicated in notions of dirty, hairy justice and frontier lawlessness, when a man could be a man and take the law into his own hands, and any smoke who crossed his path would well find himself dangling from the nearest cottonwood, and the town would have a happy barbecue, and all the white folks would smile for the camera. Lynching postcards, a fascinating part of the visual unconscious of 20th century and 19th century America. And you can see this trope again and again, the chivalric white male alone. And again, it's always problematic, and no better example just pops into my mind immediately than Batman. Batman is a Republican. What exercises him the most? Be people defiling private property, right? And he's RoboCop. He's this ithy-phallic fetish object, And I actually thought the Tim Burton film was brilliant because, the weaselly little, who's the comedian who played Batman in the first movie? Michael Keaton. Batman buffs apparently were horrified by that. But he really dramatizes the fact that, you don't need Judith Butler to tell you about performative sexuality and gender when you see this movie. He goes into Darth Vader's idea of a phone booth and is sealed into this phallic monstrosity of a suit, with the etched-on six-pack, right? In reality, it's this shriveled-up little thing. Well, this is American masculinity, in a single marvelous textbook example. And he's sealed hermetically into this carapace of manhood, and then he can go out and kick butt, and his voice changes. It becomes affectless and monotonic, like most guys in the terminal stages of testosterone poisoning. Every football quarterback you hear interviewed on TV, we fought as hard as we could. We fucked up. Sorry. It's always that Batman voice, I'm Batman. So the night is sort of problematic. Other thoughts, other questions? Gentleman in yellow.
A couple of references. Do you have something against werewolves?
Because I didn't mention them?
Yeah, you dropped a couple of references earlier on about having perfect hair.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect hair. I took that as a reference to werewolves in London.
You've outed my closeted animus against the werewolf. I stand nakedly revealed.
Certain amount of evidence that the lycanthropic personality would take on characteristics of a beast. Your reference to Blue Velvet I thought was great, and the zombie moment in Blue Velvet was when the police chief in the yellow jacket was standing there. The radio goes off, and he's standing dead. The radio goes off, and his arm falls down like that.
Yeah.
That's the zombie moment there. And I thought what your thoughts on M. Night Shyamalan's movie The Awakening was.
Regrettably, I haven't seen it. Is it a zombie film?
It is a zombie film in which there's certain weather patterns that will blow across the upper part of the Northeast, and it will cause people on the street to go into this hysterical state and kill themselves and whoever is in their path. Kind of a scary movie, but it sort of is a progression on the take that maybe that the society's producing something, some kind of continuum that will really cause people to do this. Immediately think of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, where people, 10 years ago were dying, 20 years ago were dying of lung cancer from Agent Orange. And your slide there, the zombies don't kill themselves. Well, in this M. Night Shyamalan movie, they do kill themselves.
Not having seen it, I can't be very illuminating, but I will just say tangentially that we haven't seen nearly enough weather horror. I think weather horror is the genre waiting to be born. And you can arguably, movies like 2012 and The Day After Tomorrow, are Ballardian premonitions of the horrors of global warming. I refer frequently to Ballard because he's seminal to sort of the keystone of my approach to cultural criticism. And as I said earlier, I read him as a postmodern philosopher, not an SF novelist. And Ballard's environmental horror novels, his disaster novels, The Drought and the Drowned World, now look, in hindsight, extraordinarily prescient. They're meditations on what climatologists like to punningly call global weirding. But perhaps the greatest sci-fi novel ever written on nature gothic or nature noir is Mike Davis's Ecology of Fears. Marxist Jeremiad meets climatological analysis, in the key of gothic horror. It's really never been bettered, and I recommend it to all of you thinking about this sort of thing. Yep. I'm not quite sure I follow your thread.
Well, I'm just saying that this may
The point is,
the zombie embodiment of racism and everything you're saying may not be the intent of the scriptwriter or the people making the genre. That this is just a standard thinking that may be from like I said, from anytime you see a mass outbreak, it always hits metropolis first, and you get outside of the cities to kind of slow its rate of spread.
the intentions of the author are not something that bulks large in my mind. This is sort of a standard response to critical theory and cultural criticism. Oh, you're overreading this, or what was the author's intention? Most cultural critics stopped worrying about the author's intention, around the time that Roland Barthes wrote The Death of the Author and Reading Against the Grain. And I don't mean to be flip, but, I'm simply someone who believes that when people say, oh, you're overreading, I believe all readings are overreadings, that we're reading into a text. I don't believe that anything inheres in a text. I believe that meaning is in the eye of the beholder or the mind of the beholder, right? And so our interpretive engines are what grind out meaning. So respectfully, the question of what the author's intentions are, if they're known to us, fine and well, that's one more piece in the puzzle. I don't think it's dispositive. I don't think we're ruled by the author's intention. I'll also say that, it's not necessarily the case that authors are some sort of trance channel for the public mind and that they open their mouths and are ventriloquized by the mass unconscious. But I will say that, to people who point out, and you're certainly not doing this, but there are those who say, oh, dear Lord, these are just mass confections made by committee and, Hollywood. How can you take them so seriously? Well, first of all, this returns us to Adorno and Horkheimer and the culture industry. It's a very tired critique to suggest that merely because something is banal and it's the product of consumer culture and it's intended to sell tickets and boxes of popcorn, it doesn't logically follow at all that there isn't something interesting going on under the hood. There could be, there couldn't be, all right? And the question is, do you have the sort of mind that you can use as a prism to refract meaning from it? It almost becomes a weird sort of egghead macho where you work with the most meager text, and people are like, oh, please, Lady Gaga, a doctoral dissertation, right? Don't laugh. There's now a burgeoning cottage industry in the academy, Gaga studies, right? So you can't make this stuff up. But the point is, having said that, not every myth, not every pop confection, not every disposable narrative is created alike. The gentleman mentioned the myth of the lycanthrope. Well, this isn't lycanthrope time, right? There was one werewolf movie, it sank like a stone, a furry stone. And so, that tells us something. It tells to use that groaningly corny word that, you almost cringe when you use it, the zeitgeist, that there really is such a thing as a zeitgeist, right? That there's been this ridiculous proliferation of zombie, narratives. And the inevitable comeback is, oh, that's just Hollywood copycatism. Well, yes, it is. But the engines of commerce are grinding out this stuff because it's selling. People seem to have an insatiable appetite for it. They don't have an insatiable appetite for werewolves. Okay, there's a little bit of that in Twilight, right? I'm not well familiar with that series. But in any event, I think it's instructive that, the weather vanes turn with the prevailing winds. And not all monster narratives seem to be created alike. Yes, sir. If it were all leading to a single point, it would be a fairly impoverished intellectual exercise. I mean, it's sort of like saying, what is the meaning of life? Or is there an anthropomorphic God who looks like some sort of hairy, bearded, Bronze Age patriarch? My mind doesn't work that way. I can't. It seems like the merest reductionism to insist that I boil my entire talk down to a fortune cookie aphorism. So what is the point? The point is a delicious dance with signification, and hopefully I've amused you a little bit and helped you while away an idle hour with some ruminations on the polyvalent revenant and unpacked some of its historical precedents and been thoughtful about ways in which we can read a cultural text, which is a kind of a contended text. It's part of the contest of narratives or the war of stories, and it's apparent that there are many who have a vested interest in spinning this signifier in accordance with their own agendas. So I realize your question drips irony, and I suppose I'm answering in the same key. Yeah. Just to nuance that slightly, I misspoke somewhat when I said that. What I should have emphasized was the reversal of polarities, as I said, between public and private. So yes, I use the image of the self being extruded like an amoebic pseudopod into public space, and to the extent that we exteriorize what was once our innermost self, then arguably the self is being sort of evacuated, out of the psychic receptacle and, again, extruded into public space. And inversely, I was arguing, Pace, Ballard, and some other postmodern theorists, that the empty landscape is colonized by media fictions and dreams that money can buy, that a lot of our imaginative psychic life is populated with chimera and phantasms that come from consumer culture. And we seem to live out some sort of aspirational or fantasy life in these narratives given to us by consumer culture, and that makes up a larger part of our interior life, arguably, than it did in the past. So my apologies for interrupting. I wanted to nuance what I'd said, just in case I was about to be hoisted by my own petard.
Well, it made me think that the world of meaning and narratives has as much causal power as, but in a different way, as the rest of the physical world or the virtual plane. And so our lives are kind of, shuffled around by these forces of meaningful narratives that are always changing, the zeitgeist, so to speak. And it reminded me of a friend mentioning the other day that a worry that we're all going to have to start dealing with brand management with these virtual identities that we're tagged with. And
Well, don't you think we are already hip deep in that? What is Facebook but brand management? No, I mean the brand itself. Facebook is about the sort of flattening of the self into this brand. Brand me. Wired was prattling on about this in the go-go 90s. They had a cover that said brand you was one of their issues, right? But, now on Facebook, there's this sense that you're promoting something, you're marketing something, and it's peculiar. It's kind of a commerceless species of marketing. You're always announcing what you're doing, and you're promoting that you're going somewhere, and you're advertising that you're listening to, such and such a song on what's that service that's suddenly absolutely ubiquitous? Spotify, thank you. And it feels like advertising and branding and marketing, except there's no clink of coin. It's quite peculiar. It's just social wampum. It's woofy, I think it was called by Carrie Doctorow back in the day. It's sort of the commodification of popularity, but to no discernible end, except the acquisition of a growingly epic catalog of imaginary friends, on Facebook.
How about a petri dish for the supercomputer virus of the future?
Okay. I don't know what to say to that. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, could you speak up just a hair so that everyone can benefit from your insights?
a lot of really, really relevant literature, a lot of stuff that I've been exposed to. What I wanted to ask you about was the transition from incorporating zombies from a really political to an economic sense. In the Truman Diaries, I always got the impression.
I'm sorry, are you conflating the Turner Diaries and the Truman Show?
I'm so sorry.
Not at all.
The Turner Diaries, the actual book.
I thought there had been a postmodern sequel to the Turner Diaries.
But in that book, it always felt like the racial war was instigated for a political reason. Like there were essentially, like it was old plantation fear, white women getting raped in the street by black men, and you couldn't say anything about it, otherwise it'd be politically incorrect. And some people just let people got raped instead and do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Versus the taking Omega Man or the I Am Legend story, that's obviously kind of like Omega Man would be more of like a spotlight on the communist, socialist perspective of society, but then the transition into what you're saying, where it's like it becomes a racial matter. My question to you is how do you feel that transition was facilitated over the past 10, 15 years?
Transition from what to? Forgive me for being obtuse. I want to follow your argument, but transition from what to what?
I'm a little nervous speaking, so
Oh, you're doing wonderfully.
so taking the zombie aspect, you got Omega Man that was quite clearly about communism, communists, the Slayer, all that type of stuff. And then now we're bringing this coming from The Walking Dead, where it's gone from a political perspective, where you're saying that they're stockpiling goods, they're stockpiling money, resources. Like it's now an economic thing. Like what they're afraid of, it seems like, is the failure of socialism. All of a sudden, you have a mass amount of middle class that can't feed themselves.
So let me restate the question to be certain I understand it. Are you saying that the Aryan supremacists and the survivalists have, in real life, have sort of shifted the narrative content away from Cold War paranoid myths of, nuclear annihilation to economic collapse and disenfranchised, white Rust Belt workers now set adrift in Obamaniac America? How do they come by it? How do they repurpose it to their own ends is the question? I mean, is that?
No, that's actually exactly what I was going for. I just wanted to hear your explanation of maybe how that happened.
How that happened? Well, the short answer is it's not entirely clear from their writings. They don't. There doesn't seem to be a single catalytic spark, a single historical moment where the zombie walks onto the stage of the dream life of white power America. There probably is. I simply feel I've spent enough time with the interiors of these people's minds, and my soul needs a shower, But if I were so inclined, I could take a core sample of the sedimented discourse of these chat boards and so forth, and at some point there's a late Cretaceous moment. At some point there's the moment of impact where everything becomes different and the zombie arrives, as I say, on the stage of their dreams. But the short answer is just it's a floating signifier. It's part of the air we breathe. It's one of the dominant myths of this 15 minutes at least. Tomorrow it will be something else, sprung from the brow of Lady Gaga, no doubt. And so they're, ankle deep in pop culture just like everyone else. And it's a strange sort of Aryan supremacist bricolage. I mean, like everyone in our culture, as Americans, they're lost in the supermarket. They're wandering through the Benjaminian arcades of our crud culture, and I say that with deep fondness. I love crud. But the point is that, it's like what Tijuanenses call rasquatch, right? In a form of bricolage. They pry loose the unconsidered oddments and cast-off detritus of consumer culture and stitch them together into some sort of meaningful myth. That's the essence of Levi-Strauss's bricolage. And the bricoleur uses what is to hand. He's a tinkerer. He tinkers together explanatory myths that make the world make sense for him. And in a consumer culture, the oddments and artifacts around you are consumer stuff. And so we have to use what's on the shelves of the mass imagination. And in this instance, it's the zombie myth. What's fascinating to me is how people repurpose it. And the white supremacist thing is a clear example of that. Other questions, thoughts, comments? Yes, sir.
So you play a lot on the far right extremists, people that are over paranoid, people that are kind of like this 1984 kind of over surveil type mentality, where always fearful of something. You mentioned they're living in this dream of a dystopic utopia. I was kind of wondering what your thoughts were for a lot of media. I think the other end of the spectrum is kind of utopian dystopia. Black Bill is kind of like a major form of merging as well, kind of the other end of the spectrum.
How did,
People that are like more like the extreme right, that's over paranoid people, and people that are kind of more like the Huxley's Briggs and World type society, who are more, everyone belongs to everyone else type of mentality. And I was kind of wondering your thoughts on that.
well, what's the difference between a utopian dystopia and a dystopian utopia? I'm having trouble splitting that hair.
You're saying 4 out people like in the zombie apocalypse, that have this, this fantasy of, being on a rooftop, popping out people, that are coming up, and that's kind of like their dystopian utopia. I was thinking on the other end, people.
I'm sorry, that's an example of a dystopian utopia?
Is that
I would think that's an example of a utopian dystopia. It's clearly a dystopia. That's inarguable, right? Societal collapse, the descent into what our dear friend Mr. Rawls calls the terminal moraine of depravity, place I want to live forever. So societal collapse, right, the literal breakdown of the infrastructure, and all of the sort of public sphere, all the social institutions, just crumble into shards. And so by anyone's reckoning, that's dystopic, right? But they perform the peculiar dialectical move of applauding that. And it's their big-armed embrace of what for the most of us would be an unutterable horror. I mean, roving packs of marauding gangs with belt-fed weapons. This is not a world I want to live in. They applaud it. They are hand-rubbingly, desperately eager for it. So to them, it's utopian, a utopian dystopia. So what's the question? But are you saying that there, in our current moment in public discourse, there's some group that yearns for the world of Brave New World or 1984? Or? Can you give me an example of someone who champions the Brave New World model as a realistic political philosophy and eagerly awaits the day when we live in Huxley's novel?
I mean, not directly, just like, I would probably say maybe they show like Glee or something like that.
But see, now you're conflating a media narrative and a real-world subculture, right? So, I mean, in a sense, it's apples and oranges. I mean, at the one end of the spectrum, you're saying there are these Aryan supremacists who dream of a utopian dystopia. And then at the other end, you're saying, but there are these other media narratives. I think you have to compare like to like. Certainly just so I can follow your point of argument. So do you want to take one last pass at it? Because I'm just not sure I'm... Okay, so you're imagining, is there a world that people rather more reasonable, or let's just say less virulently whacked, right, than the Aryan supremacists dream of? Are you asking, is there any utopian, a progressive version of a utopia that comes after societal collapse? You're saying what is the extreme left? Well, the worker's paradise, right? I mean, Marx is writing science fiction. He believes in teleology. He believes there's an inevitable arc to history. I'm an atheist, so I don't do teleology. I don't believe anything is inexorable, ineluctable, written by God's fiery finger before the ocean rolled. I believe it's all a random walk. So I don't get that. And Marx conveniently leaves the workers' paradise off stage, There'll be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and the lion will lie down with the lamb, and, Netflix will be free and we'll all live happily ever after, To me, it's like science fictional, But if you're looking for the left's vision of, and it adequately earns the term eschatological, right? Fundamentalist America, our friends, not necessarily on the right, but born-again Christians, evangelicals, they call themselves, a goodly percentage of them believe in the rapture. And one term for the rapture is when time will be no more. It's when the historical clock stops and utopia is over the rim of the event horizon, as it always is. That's what's great about utopian fiction. You just sort of gesture toward it. You don't have to actually work out the train schedules, and competing monetary rates and everything that it takes to make the EU run or something. But other thoughts? Yes, sir. And Professor Crandall, shall this be the last one?
One more.
Okay, one more after this guy. Okay.
I was just going to say that, well, two things. Transhumanists might be what he was looking for. And then about
Well, would you like to enlighten those in the crowd who are unfamiliar with transhumanism? I am, but some folks here may not be.
transhumanists, there's a variety of stripes. There's libertarian transhumanists, there's democratic transhumanists. But they have a very optimistic view about the future, about our capacity to use technology to overcome our humanity, essentially, or at least preserve the good parts and make more of that. And so there are many stripes of transhumanists that actually look forward to some idea of the Lord, or something. They think that there's many types, and I think a lot of that could be an example of an inversion of what you're talking about.
And it's quite a good one. I wish I'd thought of it myself. But you're leaving out one element, which is what makes it relevant to the question of utopian dystopias or dystopian utopias, which is the question of societal collapse and a post-apocalyptic world. And of course, the component in transhumanism that adequately earns that tag is the singularity, right? Every computer science geek in this room must have heard that term from the lips of Raymond Kurzweil, right? And what the gentleman is referring transhumanism, which I took a ball-peen hammer to in my 1996 book, Escape Velocity. I looked at that book as a meditation on cultural narratives of technological discourse, which is to say, in less grandiloquent verbiage, the stories we tell ourselves about machines, right? What they mean, where they're taking us, what we're becoming, right? And transhumanism, by my lights, is just rocket-finned human potential. It's Anthony Adams' Awaken the Giant Within, with a cyborg skull socket. It's the discourse of infinitely expanding personal potential. Every day in every way I am getting better and better. Emil Coué's maxim from 1890, whatever it was, cross-pollinated with meme spliced with techno-libertarian fantasies out of, David Brin or Robert Heinlein novel. I mean, I'm sorry I'm being uncharitable to it, but politically I find this stuff noxious. It's usually right libertarian, but it's bizarrely, it's sort of a geek dream of Batman bulk up, the skull socket grafted on muscles, cyborg prostheses, Sigourney Weaver in the power loader, it's clearly very Walter Mitty wish fulfillment projections for, ham radio enthusiasts still living in mom's basement. But it has this weird post-apocalyptic element that is very unlike the Turner Diaries, Aryan supremacists, Walking Dead vision of a world in which white guys can skull pop The Walking Dead with impunity, right? It's sort of everybody's video game wet dream come to life. Into the transhumanist discourse enters this thing that Raymond Kurzweil, the MIT computer scientist, I've never quite been clear on what he is besides a transhumanist. He's an evangelist. He's an evangelist for the secular theology of post-human potential. But he believes there's going to be this unimaginably bizarre symmetry break with all of recorded history in which we pass through a cosmic wormhole and live happily ever after as downloaded avatars in a virtual cosmos or something. It actually smells a lot like Teilhard de Chardin's notion of the noosphere in the 1960s, or Marshall McLuhan's bizarre rhapsodies about being fused into a cosmic mind, this strange mixture of Catholic Thomas theology and sort of technophilic rapture or eschatology. So, great example. Yes, please.
I also want to say that it seems as if the angry white man that is into this survival apocalypse stuff used to be able to see himself as the hero, had a different narrative, and that narrative got crushed. And so now, instead of being like I'm wrong, he wants the apocalypse, and he wants the world to go into become decrepit, so that he's still on top. That might be kind of maybe that's what's going on.
Right, and I think I gestured in that direction, but you just said it more clearly and concisely than I did. So I'm grateful to you for that. One thing I would nuance that point with a little bit is that this pathological vision of a return to a frontier lawlessness, where a white male landowner's word is law, and disputes are settled not with wimpy reasoned discourse, but with the business end of a six-shooter, has immense appeal, much closer to the mainstream. The Reaganite vision of government downsized to nothing, that government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem, is very much intertangled with Reagan's interest in sort of frontier myth and framing himself as a cowboy. And this radical libertarian or kind of Reaganite Republican sense of the rugged individual as a citadel, the fortress self, who need not be beholden to the nanny state in any way. That figure is really firmly fixed in frontier myth, which obviously casts an enormous shadow over the American unconscious. And the desire to return to that moment reappears again and again in these pathological bedtime stories in the dream life of Hollywood and consumer culture. Dirty Harry, and again, Batman, and these vigilante figures, Sin City, it's always, an angry white guy with a gun, Travis Bickle doing handgun drills in Taxi Driver, and so it's very much part of that sort of methane cloud, that fog bank of roiling historical fantasies, and the dream for a certain part of our culture of returning to that. And it's also very caught up in liberatory fantasies of, living in a stateless world, and notions of individualism that are very dear to the American heart, but really go against the grain of our little republic here in the democratic experiment. So there's almost an inherent tension there that's never been fully worked out. Because the rights of the individual obviously do matter, and there's a real fetishization of the individual, but at the same time there's this notion of e pluribus unum, right? Out of many, one. Well, that's a little close to Stalinist collectivism. That's the kind of thing that makes the Ayn Rands of the world very nervous. So there's a real inherent tension there. And I think Professor Crandall said we could have one last comment or question from the floor.
No, I was just going to say thank you.
Oh, you were going to.
I was going to say thank you to Mark for participating in our continuation of the questions that perhaps the drones at home participate in, and everybody's welcome to go outside and share.
And let me also say to the audience, thank you for your extraordinarily gracious and generous attention and your thoughtful and penetrating questions. It's been delightful talking to you.